Hey everyone, and this is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with explore.org. Please stand by. In just a few minutes at the top of the hour, I'll be joined by Ranger Naomi Boak from Katmai National Park. And we'll be talking bears and salmon, the bears and salmon that you see live on the webcams at Katmai National Park. So we'll be with you in just a few minutes. Thanks for joining us today, and happy Fat Bear Week. Well, hello to you, no matter where you happen to be around the world. This is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. And welcome to this latest Bear Cam play-by-play, brought to you by explore.org and the National Park Service. My name is Mike Fitz, and joining me today is Ranger Naomi Boak. She's a park ranger stationed right now in Alaska and has spent much of her time at Brooks River. So I'm delighted that she's back once again to lend her insight into the bear and salmon activity that we're going to talk about on the cameras today. How are you today, Naomi?
Oh, I'm well. I'm all caught up in Fat Bear Week fever.
As we all are. This is one of the busiest weeks of the year for us at who work on the bear cams and at Brooks River in Katmai National Park. And we're going to be looking at several different webcams on the broadcast today. We're going to have the opportunity to look at the two cameras that's currently streaming in the lower river area, so the River Watch camera and the lower river camera, to watch bears, birds, and fish in that area. We also will have the opportunity to go to Brooks Falls, and we'll be doing that quite often as our camera operators move around and give us different perspectives on the river. If you're not familiar with this location and and Katmai National Park in itself, let's take a quick tour. Katmai National Park and Brooks River is located about 300 miles southwest of Anchorage, Alaska. And Brooks River is about 1.5 miles long. It's bisected by Brooks Falls, and along with our webcam partner, Explore.org, along with our webcam partner, the National Park Service, Explore.org hosts and maintains several webcams on Brooks River. The signals from those webcams are beamed wirelessly to 2 radio repeaters on the summit of Dumpling Mountain, and then those repeaters send the signal and relay the signal to the small town of King Salmon, about 30 miles away. So that's how the signal gets out. But we're always looking for information to talk about during our broadcast. So if you want to ask us any questions in advance, look for the Ask Your Bear Cam question form in the featured comment. You can find a link to that in the featured comment at the top of the page. I'll be happy to try to answer those questions as much as I can during any of our Q&As or our live events like this one. And I have several questions in our queue today. Hopefully we'll try to get to those just depending on how the bear activity shapes up. And of course, this week, Naomi, is Fat Bear Week, and we're looking at last year's champion who was dethroned a couple of days ago by number 32 Chunk. But you want to explain a little bit about what Fat Bear Week is and how people can participate?
Sure. Fat Bear Week is a single elimination tournament like March Madness. There is our original bracket, and that pits Fat Bear against Fat Bear, and it's your opportunity to pick your favorite fattest bear. We show skinny pictures from late June and fat pictures from late September, but it's your choice. It doesn't have to be on based on how much weight they gained. It could be your favorite fattest bear because you think you love their personality that you've gotten to know over the years on Explore.org. And we're getting down there. We're getting down there to the semifinals. And today's matchup is a real tough one. It is between bear 32 Chunk, who is a boar in his prime, a big boy, and bear 128 Grazer, who came back with spring cubs, yet still managed to be really ginormous this year. And that's quite a credit to her, having 2 cubs and getting that big. And
absolutely. This is, I think, the most...
What? I was going to say, of course, and the winner of the round today, which is a nail biter, gets to move on to compete with our first finalist, Bear 747. Mike, you want to talk a little bit about Bear 747?
Well, first I want to remind everyone where you can vote in Fat Bear Week, and that is fatbearweek.org. So please go there. Please go there right now and cast your vote for either Chunk or Grazer today. One of the more competitive matchups that we've had so far in Fat Bear Week, but they're facing off for the opportunity to compete with bear number 747. And this is 747 as he was in late spring, actually. So he's a titan of a brown bear. He's a very large animal, one of the largest bears on the perhaps the largest bear on the river, certainly the largest bear that I've ever seen. So he'll be tough to beat, but he's in the finale this year, just waiting to see who he's going to meet coming up on the Fat Bear Tuesday finale tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to that, Naomi. It's been a really fun week to participate in Fat Bear Week, but the bears are working quite hard right now, looking to get fat before winter hibernation. And actually, we have a couple of Fat Bear Week competitors who have been eliminated in the tournament so far, but we have them at the falls right now. On the far wall there is number 480 Otis. One of the older adults that we have at Brooks River, and then a young adult sitting in front of him, and that is number 812. So both of these bears kind of at different life stages. Otis, in the twilight of his life, essentially. He's about 25 years old or so, and he could live much longer, but we don't know, how long he'll live, of course. So, he could be well into his 30s, but certainly an older bear, and the average lifespan of bears in Katmai is about 20 years of age, so he's beyond that average lifespan. And then 812 is a young bear who was born in 2015, if I remember correctly. So just kind of reaching adulthood this year, but growing quite rapidly.
Yeah, and just because these bears got eliminated in Fat Bear Week does not mean they stop eating and getting fat, because they've got work to do. And, of course, we know Otis is one of the hardest working bears on the river. He never stops. He may take a nap, but he'll do that right there in the river. And 812 is really, he's grown so much this year. I mean, it's hard when you see him on the river. It's really hard to recognize him. He has gotten so big.
The amount of growth that these bears undergo from summer to fall, I think is quite incredible. And that's one thing why Fat Bear Week is, I think, engaging, is that, you get to see the results of all of their hard work. I mean, bears, their profit is calories. Again, if you're not too familiar with these animals, brown bears in Katmai National Park are hibernators, so they'll go into their dens starting, fairly soon. Some of the first bears will enter their dens maybe at the beginning of November in Katmai. The large adult males, like Otis, he'll be, kind of like the last of the bears to go into their den. Maybe not until the end of November, sometimes even into the middle of December. But they're going into the den to avoid wintertime famine. It's really not necessarily cold that bothers them, it's the lack of food. So they're really storing up all of their profit that they gained in the summertime in their body mass, in their body fat specifically, so they can survive that wintertime period. And that's why we get to see them, at the falls so frequently, because they don't want to work any harder than they have to. This is their place to be efficient with their energy resources and in as much body mass as possible before they go into the den.
And
Brooks Falls is not the only. Brooks Falls is not the only place, I was going to say, Naomi, where bears can make a living at this time of the year. In fact, catch rates and the ability to make a living are actually better downstream at the river mouth. And this is just an amazing scene right now with the birds and the bears. A family group moving away from, it looks like, a large adult male who's swimming upstream, not paying attention to the family group, but the family group on the right side there just doesn't want to get too close to that adult male. Looks like maybe this could be, it's hard to tell on the camera, but this could be a 273 and her yearlings moving to the right-hand side. And we thought 879 on the camera before the broadcast started. So I think that might be him on the left.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. At this time of year, I noticed on the lower river, you talk about the family group moving away from the boar. Bears now in hyperphagia, which means they never feel sated. They're always hungry, and so they're a little testier and a little more nervous around each other than they have been earlier in the season. I've seen family groups, sows, go after subadults that are paying no attention to them. So it doesn't surprise me that 273 moved away from that boar who's really not interested in them.
Bears really do tend to show an abundance of caution oftentimes when they're faced with a threat, unless you're one of those, again, big giant males like number 879. I mean, he's a big guy, so fairly dominant along the river. And it's not uncommon for mother bears just to simply move away and avoid them. But you can see that these bears are still, the family on the right and the larger male who's submerged in the water on the very edge of our screen on the left, they're fairly close together. I mean, probably separated by 20 yards at most in that location. So bears overall at Brooks River do show a fairly high tolerance for one another. Tend to think of bears as loners and showing, intolerance for each other. But the personal space bubble for bears at Brooks River is fairly small overall.
This area has been popular all season with bears. There have been there have been salmon in the lower river that they've been able to eat all year round, which is a little unusual, right, Mike?
It is unusual to see bears fishing here for so long throughout the summer. In this area in particular, this is a typical scene for early October in the lower Brooks River, but we also saw a lot of bears scavenging fish here in early summer, which was uncommon, but it was a product of such a large salmon run that the river experienced this year. And there's a small percentage of fish that just don't make it to the falls or above the falls each year, but because there were so many salmon in Brooks River this year, I think the overall number of those fish that didn't make it was larger, and that allowed more bears to make a living in these downstream areas. And I'll give you just a glimpse of that female Naomi. I think I'm going to correct myself and suggest that this could be number 94 here instead of 73.
With her large gang of 3. The other thing is that notice that she's going head first into the water. She's diving, and a lot of bears are doing that now. Now, I haven't seen 9.4 do that, but I definitely saw a 2.73 do that. Looks a little more like 9.4, but I can't tell in the pixels. But I have noticed more bears diving down there.
And 94 is a bear that will utilize diving. Diving's not a technique that you see every bear doing all the time, but 94 is definitely one of those that will utilize that fishing technique. For whatever reason, many bears don't like to get their ears wet, or at least it appears that way. I don't know. Maybe they just don't know how to dive. I mean, they're fairly buoyant as well, especially at this time of the year with all their body fat. So it can be difficult for them to dive under the water to get at salmon that are maybe in deeper water where they can't reach it with their paws. And one reason why I suspect that this is...
I was going to say, you're about to say the same thing that I'm about to say. Another reason to think that that's 9.4 is because her 3 cubs are a year older than most cubs, and they tend to be more independent. They roam around a lot further from her than yearlings might from their mother. So I think that that's another indication that this is 9.4.
These bears here, these so-called cubs, again, in their 3rd summer, I mean, they're old enough to live on their own. And many bears are separated from their families at this age. Not at this time of the year. This is not the time of the year where bear families normally separate. There would have to be some sort of accident where, mother and cubs couldn't find one another for whatever reason, for the cubs to have to spend this winter alone. Most families separate in late spring. But they are showing, the cubs in the 3rd summer show a high level of independence, as you were touching on, Naomi. And so they don't feel like they need to stick right next to mom nearly as much as they would have done a couple of years ago or 3 years ago when they first experienced the river as young spring cubs. So there's definitely a maturation process that we see in bears. We see it with young adults. We see it with the independent juvenile bears, the sub-adult bears, but we certainly see it in cubs as well.
Yeah, this group has been very popular for rangers to watch because they kind of sprawl out, and we encounter them all over the place. So they're a great family to watch.
One of those bears just digging a little bit into the riverbank there, and it looks like it may have been consuming some of the earth. You see a bit of that cloud of water. It could be looking for maybe a fish there. But this is a spot actually that a lot of bears will go to and consume clay. And it's a little bit surprising to see bears eating earth, but it's a behavior called geophagy. Basically just means, earth hunger or earth eating. And it may help to the bears gain some sort of maybe a necessary mineral or something that they could be lacking in their diet, for instance. It could also help with their overall constitution, because when you're eating a lot of salmon, Your raw salmon, I should say, just a diet of almost pure raw salmon at this time of the year. Your bowels are going to be kind of loose, so it could help. It could have some antidiarrheal properties. They also, most of the bears at this time of the year probably have tapeworms in them from eating all this raw salmon. And while the tapeworms don't seem to have any long-term effects on them, it might be uncomfortable for them. So perhaps eating clay will help to scour their digestive tract free of tapeworms, but I'm not sure. No one knows specifically why bears do that. So there's just a bunch of different ideas. But here's one of those bears from 94's family group, just kind of munching down on some of that clay.
Mike, so I had an observation this year, and I don't know if you agree, but usually we see tapeworms hanging out the rear ends of bears, and I don't think I've seen that this year.
I think maybe the camera could have caught a couple of instances of that. I'm not sure, though. I don't remember a specific instance of that. It's when I, was a ranger at Brooks River. It wasn't something that I saw all the time, but it definitely happened frequently enough that I just suspected that tapeworms were a systemic issue at the river. But yeah, interesting point. I'm not sure. Maybe you're a webcam audience who catalogs a lot of the behaviors that people see on the webcams can chime in with a comment about that if they know anything differently than us. Back up to the falls right now, looking at one of the many young juvenile bears that is using the river right now. Just kind of enjoying I'm enjoying the scene of this bear on this rock. But this bear is scanning the water, looking for fish, maybe looking for fishing opportunities closer to the falls, but could be just a bit uncomfortable with the presence of other bears there.
This is a favorite moment for me personally, because when I started watching the cams in 2014, what got me addicted to the cams was Bear 89 Backpack, who loved to sit like a Buddha on this rock. So it is one of my favorite scenes ever to see a bear this time of year sitting on that rock.
And this rock right here is just a few yards downstream of Rooks Falls. Our webcam is mounted to the wildlife viewing platform at Brooks Falls. And while Brooks Lodge is closed, the campground is closed for their right now. Occasionally, there still might be some people wandering through the area. There's certainly still park employees and lodge employees trying to winterize the facilities at Brooks Camp. There could also be a few anglers flying in for the day from another fishing lodge in the area to do some fishing. So you may see them occasionally at the river. But if you were to stand on the wildlife viewing platform at Brooks Falls, you'd have a really great look at this rock just downstream. So we can't see the whole scene at Brooks Falls right now, but yeah, this bear is well aware of the other bears that are just upstream of it fishing at the waterfall.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell how young it is because it's really looking around. It's it's not that confident. When you see a bear like 856 in the water, it's not checking around all the time.
The real large adult males, they really only acknowledge typically the presence of other large adult males. They'll just walk through the water. They know kind of who's boss, and they'll walk through the water with an air of confidence. But you see younger bears acting a bit more timid, hesitant to approach certain areas if they're unsure of the tolerance level of the competitors that they see in that spot. And this bear could just be taking a rest, but also I definitely do suspect that, yeah, it is maybe just a little uncomfortable with the presence of some of those other bears in the near vicinity. And as our camera pans back closer to the falls, there's just birds still everywhere on the river,
Yeah.
downstream of the falls, at the river mouth. Basically every camera view, even on the underwater camera, which we don't have access to during this broadcast right now. But if you check out the underwater camera, you'll see occasionally birds diving right in front of the underwater camera. And it's been incredible for me to see the bird life on the river because it seems to be especially abundant this year.
It's been a real treat. Stand on the bridge and watch all these birds. And of course, a lot of the birds will sit they'll perch on the bridge, especially the Bonaparte gulls. Earlier in the season, the glaucous-winged gulls will sit there, but for some reason, the Bonapartes have taken over the railings on the bridge, and it's great. I mean, I love watching the birds. We don't see many eagles around at this time the way we do earlier in the season, but filled with all kinds of ducks and cormorants and different kinds of gulls, and it's a treat.
This is still 94 and her family spread out on our Riverwatch camera. You can see that though that the birds kind of gathering in more of a concentrated area, especially if we were to take a look just a little bit slightly upstream from this location. And what they're doing, there was actually one question that came in through our Bear Camp question form. People were wondering, what are the birds doing? Well, they're feeding on dead and dying salmon that the bears leave behind, partially consumed salmon, but they're also picking off salmon eggs. And this map right here shows in the dark gray areas of the lower river where salmon carcasses and salmon eggs tend to collect. So if there's any stray eggs floating in the water, that's a smorgasbord for the bears and the birds that are using the Brooks River area. So it's not surprising to see all of these gulls concentrating in these areas right now because they're trying to gain body weight and body mass before winter as well. These birds will leave the area for the most part once the salmon are done spawning, once the bears stop feeding on them, and they'll depart for areas where where they can find open water year round. Brooks River will mostly freeze over in the wintertime. It doesn't completely freeze, but there's still, for a water bird like a gull, there's going to be very, very little for them to eat. So they're going to fly to the Pacific Ocean or parts of the Bering Sea where they can find more feeding opportunities.
Mike, do you think that's still the family that we're seeing? If it is, they're really sprawled out over the river.
I think so. It really does look like a 94 silhouette a bit closer to us. And of course, switching between camera feeds, I wasn't able to keep track of where each one of the family is going. But I wouldn't be surprised if that was 94 that left on the left side of the screen, and her cubs are just all hanging out closer together on the upstream side of things. 94, interestingly enough, has never kept her cubs this long before. She's always separated from her family at the beginning of their third summer. So it was a surprise to me to see her keep her cubs into this third year.
Are there advantages to doing that for a sow?
Well, there's certainly advantages for the cubs, right? I mean, you get another year with mom, another year of learning opportunity, another year of protection. For mother though, when you're thinking about it from a reproductive standpoint, and having more litters maybe helps you to have more cubs and carry your genes, into subsequent generations. So keeping your cubs for an additional year reduces the amount of litters that you're going to be able to have in your lifetime. And bears are very slow to reproduce. They become sexually mature sometime around the 5th year of life. But many of the bears in Katmai National Park, many of the females don't successfully bear offspring until they're around 8, sometimes 9 years old. So if you're keeping your cubs for 3 summers versus 2, that really does lower your total reproductive output, but it could raise the survival rate of your cubs overall. So I think some bears just seem to have a trade-off in that sense. They're not making a conscious trade-off. They're not deciding, hey, you know what, I think I'm just going to keep these cubs another year, or I'm just only going to keep my cubs for 2 summers because that's just the way I want to do things. It's ingrained in them instinctively. But, that's one of those sort of evolutionary, trade-offs that's happening in this population of bears.
Is it possible that some of the sows that keep their cubs an extra year are not going into estrus at the beginning of the season and therefore not pushing their cubs out?
Well, family separation happens when the female goes into estrus and she weans her young at that time. And often it's the presence of an adult that's interested in the mother that drives the cubs away. It's not the male physically chasing the cubs away. It's just that mom all of a sudden seems like she's not willing to give the cubs the same amount of protection that she had before. And the cubs, realize there's something a little odd about this situation. This big boar, this big adult male hanging around mom, this is something that I'm uncomfortable with. He's a threat to me. So I'm just going to go about in my way and my own way and find another opportunity to make a living, establish my own home range. So maybe 94, just didn't experience that transition this year. Hard to say, but if she kept her cubs for a year, I think it is pretty safe to say that she didn't experience that estrus cycle. Great scene on the river looking downstream from Brooks Falls right now.
Yeah.
Brooks Falls is still, the most popular webcam to watch, I think, at this time of the year as far as viewership goes. There's often bears right in front of the camera. They're very easy to see. You see many of the recognizable characters. But downstream of the falls, really from this Riffley area that's in the foreground right now, around that bend in the river where the river disappears out of our line of sight, that is where the most productive fishing spots are for bears in late summer. And these bears are looking, in fall, these bears are looking for, again, dead and dying salmon. Upstream at the falls, you might be able to catch some fish that are a bit fresher, that haven't yet spawned or have only recently finished doing so. But downstream, you may be able to just catch dead and dying fish who are worth less calorically, but you can catch a lot more of them. And this looks like another family group here, Naomi, just catching a glimpse of some cubs on the left-hand side.
Yeah, I was seeing that because when mom caught the fish, the cubs lunged toward her to try and get some of that fish. So, yeah, they're on the shore there waiting for mom to give them some scraps. Let's see if they come out again now that she's got another fish.
It doesn't look like she's who, or they are, excuse me, going to come out and see what mom is up to. It's often up to cubs to be assertive in those situations. If they want food from a mother that's not milk, they're going to go get it from her. Oftentimes, she's going to be tolerant of the cubs taking food away. Not always, but most of the time she's going to allow them to do that. But she's not necessarily going to bring the fish to them and drop it in front of their face and say, here's some food. So yeah, we do certainly see differences in dispositions among cubs. Some of them are certainly more assertive and are more willing to go out into the river and try to take those parts of fish from mother, and others are willing to kind of sit back on the bank and perhaps less comfortable with the situation, or just have those a different personality than the more assertive cubs.
That bear was sitting on the rock just did a dash and grab, one of the tried and true fishing techniques we see here on the river.
And sitting on a rock like this actually can provide some bears a bit of an advantage because you're a little bit higher up from the water surface, maybe a little bit easier for you to see down into the water, see fish swimming in front of you. When your eyes are closer to the plane of the water, it can be harder to see through the glare on the water. And somebody actually was asking, let me see if I can bring it up here, about the stages of bears fishing. Tandy wrote in and wondered, about sort of like the stages of bear fishing. I'm just paraphrasing here, but he or she wrote, I heard their eyesight isn't very good. So does smell play a bigger role when they're catching fish? So Naomi, do you want to talk about the role of sight versus smell and how bears are utilizing those senses when they're fishing at the river?
For bears, the smell is probably their most powerful sense, and they're using that all the time to obviously smell where fish are, to smell where other bears are, to smell us. We notice that on very windy days, we see fewer bears out because that compass of theirs, their noses, is not working so well. The wind's coming from different directions. It's harder for them to tell, is there a more dominant bear coming near me? But they have good eyesight as well, and good hearing. So they use all their senses, but those noses are used all the time, and they have, maybe you could talk about this, Mike, their noses are a lot more complex than ours.
Yeah, inside of their nasal cavity, they just have orders of magnitude greater surface area devoted to capturing scent. So, while the membranes in our nasal passages, I read, where we have our scent detecting cells, maybe that's only about the size of a postage stamp in our nasal cavity. For a bear, it's almost the size of the front page of a newspaper. So that tells you just how much space they're devoting inside of their nasal cavity. It's just a really thin, complex scaffold of bones in there. So they're devoting a lot of space inside of their nasal cavity to capturing scent. But they're also devoting a lot of brain power to capturing scent as well. There's not a whole lot of research on this, but the research I've been able to find suggests that their olfactory bulb is much larger than a human's. So they are devoting a lot of brain power to interpreting the odors that they're capturing in their environment. So scent helps them to navigate the world. It helps them to recognize different bears, who's friendly, who's foe, which bears you've encountered before. It helps them to find food across a wild landscape. But when they're looking into the water, like these bears that we're looking at in the plunge pool, this jacuzzi just downstream of Brooks Falls, they're not using scent to capture those individual fish. They're using their reflexes as best they can, looking into the water like this one bear is doing right now, just by sticking its face, looking for salmon in front of it. And then the bear in the jacuzzi is really using its reflexes to capture fish that might bump into it, because it can't actually see down into the bubbles, pooling up from the action of the waterfall.
And Otis is back there in the far pool in his office.
Slow and steady Otis in the upper left corner. There's also a bear that's harder to see downstream of him against that far wall. That could be number 820. He's an adult male, a younger adult male who's kind of maturing into the prime of his life. He was first identified a few years ago. Otis in that far corner back there, he was first identified way back in 2001 as an older subadult or young adult. So that places him today, in his mid-20s. But these two bears in front of us, closer to the camera, showing a fairly high tolerance for one another. And that's something that we've also seen frequently this year, Naomi, is just a very high tolerance between the bears for others. If you're looking to watch the cameras this year and looking for, really knockdown, drag-out fights, this is not the year for it.
Well, bears, seems to me, don't really like to fight. They do when they have to, or they feel they have to assert themselves. But there was so much salmon this year. There didn't really have to be fighting to claim certain fishing spots. And we know that bears here around Brooks Falls are in closer proximity to each other than brown bears in most places. So they have a hierarchy. They know what bear is more dominant than they are, or what bear is less dominant, and their place in the hierarchy. And this year, you would see bears maybe jawing at each other and growling a little bit, or strutting in front of one another, but no fights. That was just like saying, hey, you know who I am, and I own this spot, and so back off. So it was a very peaceful year. The most violent scene I saw was 719 going after a couple of playing subadults to keep away from her cubs, but that was not very violent. She just went in and said, get out of here.
And mother bears are typically the most defensive of all bears, and they can be maybe the most dangerous to encounter in a surprise encounter because of their defensiveness. So that's just a reminder to give all bears space, but especially be cautious in a surprise encounter if you happen to run into a mother brown bear and her cubs. But overall, yeah, the tolerance of bears at the river this year was very, very high. We saw different families playing with one another down near the mouth of Brooks River. So we would see cubs from different litters coming together and playing with one another. We saw even one mother bear who you just mentioned, Naomi, 719, actually playing with a couple of young bears that approached her. And I had never seen a mother bear playing with any other bear except for her cubs. So I think that helps to underscore what the availability of food can do for these animals when they're released from the competition of finding and competing for food. It may allow them to express behaviors that they have inside of them, but they just can't afford to express because they're so focused on finding food and making sure that they eat enough before winter hibernation.
But I'm going to say, you also can see a change in behavior in the fall, whereas a bear like 719 or some of the other sows were, like say Divot, pretty tolerant of other family groups earlier in the season. My last few weeks at Brooks, I didn't see all that friendliness. I saw sows being a lot more protective of their cubs, and I think that has a lot to do with hyperphagia and this intense hunger that these bears experience. So they became less tolerant.
That may very well be the case as we look across the river here at number 820 on the far wall. Bears right now are experiencing an annual phase in their life called hyperphagia, and it happens in late summer, early fall for them. It's a behavior that we can see where they spend most of their waking hours eating. And if they're not doing that, they're sleeping and digesting their earnings. They may partake in some other activities, like you'll still see some bears playing at this time of the year, but really their main focus is entirely on finding food and eating food. And then internally, their bodies really are suppressing the mechanisms that would make them feel full after a large meal. So they feel this insatiable urge to eat at this time of the year. And that's an adaptation that allows them to gain the fat reserves, again, necessary into hibernation. You're wondering sometimes if, people might wonder, why would a bear do such a thing? Or why is it doing this? Or why is it spending so much time standing in the water, really looking like it's not doing anything? And it's really, again, about efficiency, making sure that it's able to gain enough calories before it goes into the den. So 820 here looking for fish to swim right in front of his face. It may not be the most active fishing strategy, but it can be quite rewarding when the salmon are moving through that area, because he's not going to expend any extra energy than he would standing or sitting on land, as he compared to what he's doing right now. So So bears are trying to be very efficient in making sure that they're gaining those fat reserves necessary.
And obviously 820 has done very well.
Yeah, good looking bear, glossy furred at this time of the year, and all of the bears have really nice fur. If you tune into the webcams earlier in the summer, they're shedding in early summer. So sometimes they shed all at once, sometimes they shed in kind of in patchy blocks, and it can almost make some of the bears look a bit mangy. But that's a normal process that they undergo. But right now, yeah, the bears just have a beautiful, thick, glossy fur coat. It's not necessarily that fur coat that is going to help keep them warm in the water, though. The fur doesn't really have any special properties that will help keep them warm. It's really just their overall physiology, their adaptations for being cold and wet, and also that body fat they have. When you're surrounded by a couple of inches of body fat, that does help to keep you warm in cold, wet conditions.
Mike, you want to show that picture of that early season picture of 747 again? He has the worst shed pattern. I think you can see it in that photo.
Yeah, let me bring that up here.
Here we go. He really has a patchy shed pattern in the early season. Big bald patches.
He's actually looking. I was going to say, Naomi. Sorry to interrupt, but he's looking pretty kempt in this photo right here compared to what he looks like in early July.
That actually, I think, was a late June photo. I think it's just the angle. You didn't see the other side where he has a really big bald patch. And also 820 exhibiting one of the hallmarks of these bears, patience.
They're certainly going to exhibit less of that when they are hungrier, so to speak. I mean, these bears have been really well fed all summer, so I'm not sure how that changes their urge, to eat at this time of the year. I still think they're all experiencing hyperphagia, but many of the bears, if not all of the bears at the river this year, have not been experiencing a lack of food. So maybe some of these bears could be more willing at this time of the year to express that patience. But 820, really good at that. In this position in the far pool against that far wall, this is a spot that we see several bears fishing. And then upstream of him, Otis is probably still in that corner, and Otis, again, is the master at displaying patience. He'll probably move less at the falls than probably any other bear that we could potentially watch on the cameras. The only time he seems to really move is if he's not finding success over an hour or so, or if another bear comes in and displaces him from his preferred fishing spots. I'm going to pan upstream here and take a look at Otis.
Oh, he's big.
This is one of the more recognizable bears on bear cam and perhaps in the world. I recognize Otis at this time of the year by his grizzled brown fur. It's fairly light in color compared to many of the adult males. A lot of the other adult males have darker brown fur. He also has a slightly floppy ear. You can look at his right ear and see it kind of hangs down just a little bit, and that's even more of a recognizable feature in early summer. It seems to plump up just a little bit with the more weight that he happens to gain.
I think I've had sympathetic or empathetic hyperphagia this week during Fat Bear Week. I seem to be more hungry.
Maybe you're experiencing just a little bit of what these what you've been watching. Maybe watching two bears too much, Naomi.
Yeah, I've been watching too many fat bears and talking about Fat Bear Week too much. I think I need to look back at the skinny photos for a while for my own health. But he really looks great. I mean, here's an older bear who knows what he's doing, and he looks great.
Yeah, a good looking bear for this time of the year. And Otis, again, is one of those bears that shows quite a bit of adaptability. He's no longer as dominant as he used to be. He can no longer compete for the jacuzzi or the fishing spots in the far pool when younger, larger adult males are there. So he's been able to change his behavior in order to make a living and find success. And he's done a really great job at that over the past several years. And just to compare Otis from what he looks like earlier in the summer, this wasn't from this year. This photo was from early July of 2019, but he looked very similar. So Otis gained a tremendous amount of weight over the past several months.
So we were talking about who might still be at Brooks, and we see there's some anglers there. They come here this time of year as well.
It's often surprising for new viewers to see people walking through Brooks River, but Brooks River is the most visited in Katmai National Park, and there are actually very little restrictions on where you can go when you arrive at Brooks River. So it's not uncommon to see anglers walking through the water. They're not fishing for salmon necessarily, but what they're doing is they're fishing probably for rainbow trout, Arctic char, dolly varden, and maybe a few other fish species there. But they're generally shying away from fishing for salmon and looking for more of those, especially the rainbow trout. Brooks River is a very famous stream for its homegrown trout that can grow up to 5 pounds and more than 30 inches long. I'm going to take a look downstream here. We actually haven't gotten any great views of bears eating salmon yet today. They've been doing it, but they've all been kind of far away from the camera. But our lovely camera operators are giving us a good view of this bear right now. And they can make quick work of their salmon meals at this time of the year, Naomi, really, especially since a lot of these salmon are already dead and have started to decompose.
Yeah, if you're actually there on the river, you can see the riverbed is just strewn with really decomposed salmon, and they're not gonna eat those that are really gone. There's not much there for them.
The brain is one of those parts of the fish that the bears will target even at this time of the year. And it looks like the bear is kind of chowing down on that part of the fish. They'll eat the skin. The skin seems to have maybe a slightly higher fat content at this time of the year. The muscle tissue, though, is really degraded compared to when the salmon first arrived. So the salmon, when they go into fresh water, they stop eating. And they're surviving on their energy reserves that they bring in with them from the ocean. So their tissues contain much less calories overall. But the brain is a fatty organ overall, but it may have a larger percentage of fat reserves in it compared to other parts of the salmon. Perhaps because for your brain to function, it can't degrade like the other parts of your body. If your muscles atrophy, you can still sometimes the salmon might still be able to think clearly if they keep that fat content in their brain. So we often see bears targeting that part of the fish.
Of course, that bear surrounded by gulls. We're waiting for some of that bear's scraps.
Working, baby.
And as we only have a few minutes left in our broadcast, Naomi, but one thing that I wanted to mention before we sign off for the day is that this is kind of peak time for bear watching at Brooks River for the late summer and fall period. The peak of the spawning period has essentially ended by now, even though there still are many salmon spawning in Brooks River. The availability of those fish is going to decrease quickly over the next couple of weeks or so. But we can still see a lot of bears right now, and I think this is a bear that has been occasionally seen on the webcams this summer. This looks like another family, just kind of looking at her grizzled blonde fur with a couple of large 2.5-year-olds. They're not quite as big as her, but they're close to it. So I think this is another one of those many family groups that we've been seeing on the river this year.
Which really says great things about this ecosystem, that we can have that many family groups.
And really the scene that we've been enjoying on the broadcast today, the tournament called Fat Bear Week that we're celebrating this year, it's all due to the salmon. The salmon are what drive this ecosystem, the phenomenon of watching bears at Brooks River. Without these fish moving through the river in large numbers, we wouldn't have this opportunity to watch bears here, because bears would have no reason to gather here in large numbers. Bears would occasionally wander through, but it would not be a world-famous bear watching destination. And we can even see a little bit of that in the numbers of bears that use the river on a yearly basis. The red line, the red solid line that goes across the graph is salmon escapement plotted against year by year, plotted against bear numbers. And you can see when that red line dips, eventually the bear population will. We've been seeing a steady and slow increase in bear numbers along Brooks River over the last few years, because the salmon runs have been really strong recently, and especially this year overall. So salmon, when we want to enjoy the bears at Brooks River and everything that they provide in our lives and the enjoyment they provide, we have to think back why they're here, and it's all because of these fish.
And the fish are part of the human history of the Brooks River too, which is another fascinating thing. I mean, there have not always been a lot of bears on the Brooks River, and a few thousand years ago, humans decided that they wanted to be on the Brooks River because there was a lot of salmon. So the salmon seem to be the constant in the river.
Brooks River has been one of the most continuously occupied places in Alaska over the last 5,000 years. So really our national park idea is, just sort of the latest sort of cultural iteration that has taken shape at Brooks River. So we're certainly, not the first people to enjoy this place. This is, it's a special place for people, going back many thousands of years, and many people who are descended from residents that lived within Katmai National Park before this area as part of the national system. Many people who still live in the King Salmon and Naknek area have very close ties to this river and still consider it sacred in a lot of ways. A lot of us can relate to that. Whether we are religious or not, Brooks River means a lot to people around the world, and I know you share that opinion as well, Naomi.
Oh yeah, it's a very special place, and has been for me long before I was privileged enough to be a park ranger there. So, and it makes us all more committed to our mission to help preserve this place as a whole.
It's been great to watch these bears today. There's going to be a lot more bear watching on the cameras that you can enjoy before the Brooks Falls camera goes dark for the night. Just due to the lack of daylight at this time of the year, we have to shut the camera off at night. Alaska time to conserve battery power. The Falls camera is powered through solar energy. So we just have to manage that carefully. But if we do so, we'll be able to give you views of the river longer into the fall than previous years. Fingers crossed for that. But it depends on sunlight. The lower river cameras will stay on as long as the generators down at the mouth of Brooks River that provide electricity to the lodge area are on. And we'll let you know once we get where those generators will be turned off for the year. But don't forget to participate in Fat Bear Week. Today is the second semifinal match. It's between 128 Grazer and number 32 Chunk. It's one of the more competitive matchups that we've had in the tournament so far this year. And you can cast your vote for that on fatbearweek.org. Naomi and I are going to be back online tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 o'clock Alaska, to wrap up Fat Bear Week, talk about the final matchup, and discuss more about these wonderful bears and the fish that they depend on at Brooks River, and sort of wrap up the bear camp season. So please tune in for that broadcast. I'm certainly looking forward to it. And Naomi, thanks for joining me today and helping us learn more about the bears and salmon at Brooks River.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. And please, everyone, don't forget to vote at fatbearweek.org.
Absolutely. Do duty. Head over to fatbearweek.org and vote right now. My name is Mike Fitz with Explore.org. My guest today has been Ranger Naomi Boak, or co-host, I should say, Ranger Naomi Boak with Katmai National Park. Stay well during these challenging times and enjoy the bear camps until we talk to you another time.